think everyone is here now, so over to you, Dr. Mary Harrington.
Let me introduce myself. My name is Mary Harrington, and I'm a consultant geriatrician. I've been associated with Hourglass, well, actually, in its previous terminology as well, for a long time. And I'm just going to explain a little bit about how sexual abuse, which is the topic that we're going to cover now, was part of the driver to me becoming involved with Action on Elder Abuse and then Hourglass. When I was training decades ago in the 1980s, I observed but had no training in just a couple of patients who clearly had been the victims of sexual abuse. And I was quite horrified at the inaction that just nobody did anything. Nobody knew what to do. Nobody wanted to talk about it, and I certainly didn't get any training. Now, roll forward a little bit, and I became a consultant in my own right, and as a result of some more physical aspects of abuse, I started doing expert witness work, and then I got approached by the Met, because some of you may remember something called Minstead, which was a huge and long-lasting investigation into a gerontophile's activities. Roll forward again, and I was in Manchester, where one of our other contributors is coming from, and I was doing some departmental training. And one of the people there, who was senior to me, said he had never heard the word gerontophilia. So over a 30-year span, we'd got nowhere. Let's hope that there is more hope for somebody admitted to hospital now as a result of what Hourglass is doing in opening up these discussions. That's my introduction. Now I'd like everybody else to introduce themselves. Poppy, please, first.
Hi, my name is Poppy Everton. I work here at Hourglass as one of the frontline service leads for high-risk casework. I'm also an independent domestic violence advisor and independent sexual violence advisor. I've been in the charity for the last 4 years, and previous to that, my work was in the health and social care sector. So I worked across care and nursing homes, mostly focusing around dementia specialisms and also palliative care.
Thanks, Poppy. Mike, would you introduce yourself next?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Wilkinson. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive of New Pathways. For those of you that haven't heard of New Pathways, we provide specialist support for people affected by rape and sexual abuse. We run 6 sexual assault referral centres in Wales and provide a range of other services as well, including counselling and advocacy services. My association with New Pathways started in 2003, which only seems like yesterday sometimes, and sometimes it seems like it's 50 years. But I started as a volunteer counsellor for New Pathways. I trained as a cognitive behavioural therapist, and I eventually escaped my day job, which at the time was working in the prison service, and joined New Pathways as a member of staff on their payroll in 2008, and I've been here ever since. My particular interest in this particular issue is that some of my early clients were people in their 70s, and I was the first person they told about abuse that they suffered as a young child, and they carried that for 6 or 7 decades, and that's always stuck with me, and I thought we can do better than that. So yeah, so it's been a passion of mine ever since. So just delighted to be here today joining you anyway.
Thanks, Mike. Duncan, could you introduce yourself as well? Oh, have we lost Duncan?
No, I just lost the button.
Oh, that's all right then.
Hi, everybody. My name's Duncan Craig, and I am the founder and chief executive of We Are Survivors, based in Greater Manchester. We're now the largest male survivor organisation in the UK, and we support boys and men who have been affected by what we refer to now as sexual harms. We work both in the community, and we also have services across all 15 prisons in the Northwest.
Thank you. Right, now I've got a series of questions to get us started, but obviously there is the opportunity to put comment and questions in the chat, and we will finish the formal panel contribution a few minutes earlier than our scheduled time of past, in order to give everybody the opportunity to respond to questions that come up as we go along. So, Poppy, first, your work is with older victim survivors. What themes around sexual abuse in later life, in terms of who's affected and where it happens and how it's not being talked about, would you like to bring to our attention?
Thank you, Mary. So, I mean, in working with older victim survivors, there are several clear themes that do emerge around sexual abuse in later life. Abuse does affect both men and women, although older women are disproportionately represented. I would like to comment, though, that this, in my eyes, is potentially because men and boys don't feel that there's necessarily the structure and support out there, and there are extra biases that may stop them from making those disclosures. So although older women are disproportionately represented, I do want to sort of make the point that older men and may also be very much, it might be a drop in the ocean of what we know in terms of the scale of that issue. It also can often involve individuals who are dependent on others for care, mobility, or just daily living. It frequently occurs in private or semi-private settings, so this can include care homes, sheltered housing, the older person's own home, and it is commonly perpetrated. We see situations where it is partners, ex-partners, paid carers, and also what is often most shocking to people is that perpetrators can also be other members of that person's family, including adult children. And that is something that we have seen within our service. I think despite its prevalence and the fact that all of us here as specialists know that this is a really wide-reaching issue, sexual abuse in later life does remain mostly hidden and quite a taboo topic. Victim survivors may rarely feel they can speak out due to the shame they may experience, the fear of losing their independence. They may have a cognitive impairment, or there may be a concern about not being believed. Unfortunately, this silence is often reinforced by societal ageism and professional assumptions that older people are asexual and actually have no interest in sexual activity. And that is a bias that we see that, again, often hinders disclosures because there is that feeling of an older person feeling as though they will be prejudged or thought of differently if they express the sexual activities that they are involved in. And quite rightly so. I don't think we should all sit here and assume that once you reach the age of 60, 65, that you become somebody who is asexual and not interested in any sort of sexual activity. I think a lack of tailored services and conversations also make older victim survivors feel sort of less able to disclose. It leaves a lot of abuse invisible to both safeguarding systems and also the criminal justice process. And I think one thing, and I've said this previously, one of my first interactions with a victim survivor of sexual abuse who happened to be in their 90s and was unfortunately sexually assaulted in a hospital setting. The first person that person disclosed to within that hospital setting, which I think we can all agree is a very brave step to take, the response that they were met with was dismissive and ultimately can be summed up in saying, well, why would anybody want to do that to you? And I think this view we have as a society, and I think too often sexual abuse is tied in with this idea that the victim of that must be the perfect victim, i.e., sort of conventionally attractive, somebody that ultimately has been targeted for their appearance, shall we say, Whereas I think we need to be taking more of a focus on the fact that this is often about dominance, around control, and the fact that whether somebody is attractive or not does not come into it in the slightest. And I think as a society, we really need to shift that view so that when older people do feel able to make disclosures, which ultimately we want to see more of across the board, they need to be handled appropriately. They need to not be dismissed, not feel like they aren't going to be believed, and the appropriate support at that point needs to be offered.
Thank you, Poppy. Some good points, very succinctly made there. Thank you. Duncan, can I come to you next? Greater Manchester's the first area to launch this violence against men and boys strategy, which you're a co-author of. Can you talk about the impact that this could have for older victim survivors more widely, but particularly about the impact on older men?
Yeah, thank you. So, many people don't necessarily realize that for the past 15 years, when we have talked about sexual harms, when we've talked about domestic abuse, when we've talked about so-called honor-based abuse, what we used to call so-called honor-based killing, but we now refer to it as so-called honor-based abuse, and forced marriage, that all of those crimes that we think about as being VAWG, violence against women and girls, that they've always included boys and men. And what I mean by that is the data set. So every time that the data set is published in the annual reports, or every time that a minister, an MP, a politician, a civic leader is developing strategy and policy, the VAWG strategy, the national VAWG strategy, is what we refer to. It's always been a real bone of contention for me as a survivor myself, as a male survivor myself. It's always been a real bone of contention around the fact that me and my fellow male survivors, we're not seen, we're not visible. And I guess listening to what Poppy was just saying then, if anybody knows about invisibility, it's older people. How at a certain point, society will often stop seeing people because they're older. And so when we decided that we would push harder locally because we weren't getting anywhere nationally, our mayor and our deputy mayor agreed to that we could commissioned us to agree that we could develop this strategy specifically for males. Now, the first thing that does is it gives us exactly what I was talking about that we don't have: visibility. And that is so important. It's really important, not just in the sense of males as victims in general, but when you begin to start looking at spaces such as care homes, hospitals, prisons, secure units, anywhere where we put people, and I've used that term loosely, but I also use it on purpose. Having a strategy that points to boys and men as victims feels like it gives us the ability to go to the decision makers and the service providers to say, hey, what are you doing about this population? About the 1 in 6 males that have experienced sexual harms at some point in their life. What are you doing about them? When everybody is talking, for all of the right reasons, by the way, everybody is talking about women and girls. And so our hope with the strategy is that it's going to create visibility. The second point to it is when we begin to start thinking about older abuse or abuse of older people, there is some extra bits when we're dealing specifically with sexual abuse. So when talking about men and boys, we know that the data tells us that men and boys take on average around 20 years to speak out. whereas females take in excess of round about 6 years, if not said anything at the time of something happening. So we know that men are carrying the secret longer. And over the past few years, as we've got more awareness of illnesses and conditions such as dementia and issues that we know disproportionately affect older people, the thing that we've begun to see is how for so many people who are suffering with conditions such as and illnesses such as dementia, is a lot of things come back and we're not necessarily prepared for that. Services are not. And so this new strategy, I believe, is going to help us point to the need to see men and boys as victims. Then finally, the other bit, which nobody really wants to talk about, is what do we do about those that have committed offences? When we're dealing with sexual harms, we have to really think about the whole system. And again, I just want to say, as a survivor, I know it's often difficult for people to hear this. It's difficult for my fellow survivors to hear this. But in one of our prisons, the majority of people in a particular area of the prison are much older people. We're talking 60 plus. And so we've got to really begin to start thinking about recognizing how we deal with that population. That's a new population that we haven't necessarily catered for. And at some point, they're going to come back into the community. What are we doing about ensuring that that older population are dealt with properly and appropriately? We've got to move away from the good and the bad. We've got to move away from the males and the females, and we've got to start being responsive to the person in front of us. And that's what I hope our new strategy will do.
Great, thank you very much indeed for that summary. And I'm going to bring in Mike, the third member of the of this panel now. Mike is from New Pathways in Wales, and I would like you, Mike, to talk about the Welsh approach. What does Wales do particularly well when it comes to sexual abuse and violence, and obviously the focus in older people of this conference? And can you identify any key differences that are important to the other attendees?
Thank you, Mary. Yes, the answer is that there's quite a lot going on in Wales, and I'm be pleased to tell you about those now. But firstly, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that Poppy and Duncan said, because they really resonated with me as they were speaking. Poppy spoke about the fact that older people not being recognised as people that could potentially be affected by sexual violence. And that speaks so much to the response we've had from some of the older people that we've worked with, where they have attended health professionals with injuries that are consistent of sexual violence or sexual assault. And had they been a 20-something presenting with those injuries, the person they were speaking to would have undoubtedly said to them, "Oh my word, what has somebody done to you?" But because of their age, their response has been, "Oh my word, what have you done to yourself?" In terms of there's this presumption that you're old, you're clumsy, you're frail, you've got injuries because of those circumstances, without looking at the blindingly obvious and asking the right questions. So that really kind of resonated with me. And also with Duncan about men not being visible. We support around about 10,000 people each year through our organisation. About a third of those are children and young people. So, and just as an aside, up to kind of teenage years, the gender split is almost parity. So it's about 40% boys. that drops off a cliff when they get to kind of teenage years and all those things about, you know, men aren't victims and you know, and all those kind of societal things. So our referrals drop off a cliff until later on. They haven't stopped being victims and survivors of sexual violence. They've just stopped telling anybody. So that's kind of reflected. If you look at our adult counselling services, about 20% are male, about 12% of our SARC clients are male. So it's not insignificant figures. But we need to create visibility so that people and men can come forward. So, sorry, soapboxing for you there, Duncan. So, in terms of what we're doing in Wales and what is going well, there's quite a lot going on in Wales. I'm really pleased to say. A lot of it stems from 10 years ago to this month, actually. Welsh Government brought out specific Vowdr SV legislation, so violence against women, domestic abuse and sexual violence legislation, which is the first of its kind in the UK. And that set out several things. Firstly, we had the appointment of a national Vowdr SV advisor in Wales. That was a critical friend to government in terms of what should be done. It set up a training framework in terms of addressing these issues and various other things. It also puts statutory guidance and duties on local authorities to recognise this issue and do something about it. So a lot of things have stemmed from there, which is really good, and it's something that we talk about a heck of a lot. We've also got an older persons commissioner in Wales, and we're very fortunate that the current incumbent in that role was somebody who was previously the Vowdr SV national advisor. So we're pushing at an open door there. So we're quite, some of the things that we're doing as a multi-agency approach. Firstly, we're looking at the training for professionals who engage with older people, to make sure that they are professionally curious and they do ask the questions when they're presented with the blindly obvious, and then don't just fall back on assumptions. And that is really bearing fruit in terms of the work that we're doing. I'll give you a very small example. There was two nurses at a hospital in Cardiff called Landock Hospital, and they were providing end-of-life care for a gentleman there. And because they've been on training in terms of sexual violence disclosures and recognized the cues, they were able to talk to the gentleman and elicit the fact that he was sexually abused as a child. He'd never told anybody. And so they didn't just take the easy option of thinking, okay, but it doesn't matter, this poor gentleman was on his last legs, so let's not bother. They contacted us. We got two of our visitors, went out and met with the gentleman, bore witness to what he was saying. And there was no prospect of a conviction because the perpetrator had long died. But that individual got so much from that, the fact that he was heard, he was witnessed, and he was able to get that off his chest. So that's just a small example of how some awareness training can make a massive difference to people's lives, particularly at, you're talking about gentlemen end of life care, and still they bothered and were able to provide him some comfort. Other things that we're doing is something I'm involved with at the moment. We're doing training and awareness in residential settings, and I don't just mean older persons residential homes, I mean retirement settings, etc., etc. So we did quite a lot of focus groups with residents. I did one myself a couple of months ago. We had a group of 8 who came and did a focus group. Of those, 6 of them had been affected by either domestic abuse or sexual violence during their lifetimes. Not a great surprise. None of them had ever told anybody about it and had any support, because A, they didn't know how to tell people and find the words to do that. And they were completely unaware of what services were available to them. And one lady I was speaking to was currently experiencing coercive control and threats from a former husband. We were able to intervene and put services in place. So it's really important that we do go to the places where people are and ask the questions, and we're starting to do that in Wales. One of the things that we've just had agreed is that we're adopting, through work through the Older Persons Commissioner, a specific risk assessment for older people. And this doesn't exist anywhere else in the UK at the moment, so we're going to be trialling that. We're looking at specific safeguarding training for older people, because at the moment you can get safeguarding training on children and young people or adults. There's nothing else. And there are specific issues, as we know, we've spoke about today, with addressing the safeguarding needs of older people and making sure that if they can't be their voice, somebody else is picking up on the clues and be their voice for them. So that's in the pipeline. Also, a bit of a shout out to Welsh Government as well. I mean, they are actually doing a comms campaign this autumn, which is specifically based on older people and sexual violence. And I don't know of anybody else that has done that previously, and that's their single focus. And I think that's absolutely marvelous. So they've worked with our older clients, they've worked with other older people in our community who have been affected and there's survivors and victims of sexual violence, to make sure they get that messaging right, to make sure they get the optics right, and to make sure they go to places where people are going to pick up on the message. It's just not some social media kind of mail shot that people aren't going to pick up on. So yeah, we're doing a lot more needs to be done. Words are great, resources are better. So we're pushing on that. But yeah, there's quite a lot being done.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, this next question that I'm going to put to all of you, because of the expertise of this panel, is about the criminal justice aspects of this. Can we have your views on how well the police, the prosecution services, and the courts recognise and respond to sexual abuse of older people, and where do you see the gaps? You've talked about training for staff, you've talked about giving opportunities, but then it has to go somewhere else, doesn't it? Can we talk about the criminal justice services in this?
I'm happy to start if that's
You'll
okay
have to
with
start.
everyone.
Thank you.
So I do think that unfortunately, I don't feel that older people are responded to as well as they should be. And I think that is one of the main reasons that we have brought this as a panel discussion, ultimately, to raise awareness of these gaps, particularly around statutory recognition of this type of abuse. I think, unfortunately, we have a lot of age-blind policies. So police responses will often focus on domestic abuse or sexual violence in general, without recognising how the age-related factors, so things such as possible levels of frailty or health concerns, dependency on a person, potentially that perpetrator for support, or levels of cognitive impairment. And all of these can alter the dynamics and particularly alter the risk level that we see in cases like this as well. Overall, I think there is an under-recognition of older victims' reports. We see situations where these are often minimised or misinterpreted. And as I believe it was mentioned on one of the previous panels around police responses, we did see a tag being used across a police force, which was mentally infirm, e.g. dementia. And ultimately, that tag alone invalidated what the person had disclosed during that interaction with that police officer. So the most concerning thing to this was that they're essentially being invalidated in their experiences, potentially having that brushed off because of a cognitive issue that actually hasn't been checked or followed up in any way. So 9 times out of 10, what we were finding was these older people had no levels of cognitive decline. But what had happened was an officer had gone out to that scene, seen an older person in a state of distress, potentially has just suffered something horrific that's happened to them. But because they presented as confused, unable to maybe explain the timeline or have a level of dissociation, the immediate assumption there has been mental lack of capacity and dementia. And this does go directly against the Mental Capacity Act, where we should be assuming that somebody has capacity unless tests and follow-ups have been done which specifically state otherwise. And I think we need to be really careful in these systems that we're using on how we're approaching older people, because ultimately, if they have been brushed off at the first point of disclosure, we are not going to see them represented in police statistics, in court cases, not to mention, and I will give the gents a chance to come in here, but the delays in courts alone and the way that it's run in my opinion, not a very trauma-informed way. I've had experiences where special measures have been declined, people with physical disabilities expected to appear in person with high levels of trauma, and ultimately in a place that feels completely inaccessible for them. So how are we supposed to sit here and tell older people to feel comfortable making these disclosures, reporting and potentially looking at prosecution when the system isn't set up to properly support them in doing any of that, in my opinion?
Thank you. Duncan, Mike, either of you like to add to that?
Duncan,
Yeah,
after you.
Oh,
thank you. I won't go over what Poppy said, but I mean I wholly agree with her. The extra bit that I would add into that though is when the individual who is older, if they were abused by somebody who was the same age or slightly older than them, when they finally get to that point, there's often a question about whether the perpetrator is fit to appear in court, etc., etc. And what sadly I've noticed, and this is purely anecdotal, nobody's done any formal research on this yet. If anybody's interested in a PhD, there's a really good PhD in this question, which is about what do we do about older survivors where the perpetrator is still alive? And how are we supporting them when inevitably, and again, anecdotally, but inevitably, there will be no court case because the perpetrator is deemed not to be well enough to attend court and go through the process, etc., etc. It feels like it is a barrier to support, a barrier to the criminal justice system that many others don't necessarily experience. There is something very much that it feels to me, and again, anecdotal, I'm going to keep repeating that this is what we keep noticing for older survivors. I think,
you're talking about a triple jeopardy here.
yeah, that's a really good way of putting that.
And part of the issue is the unreliability of the statistics,
Yeah,
the data collection is very, very poor. That
yeah,
is on a list of questions had we got all afternoon, but I think we can just
yeah,
all of us immediately agree the data is very poor and we need
yeah.
to work towards getting better data. Mike, I cut you off. Do you
Okay.
come in on something?
Yeah, just regarding the police. I mean, yeah, yes, the court delays are horrific. We have clients waiting 4 and 5 years to get their cases to court. Sometimes those cases are bumped at the last minute, and that happens multiple times where you get clients build themselves up to go and give evidence, and at the last minute the case is pulled, and it's not pulled to the following day, it's pulled for another 6 months. So that's a big issue. And I think that the central governments have made a statement that they're going to bring in specialist sexual violence courts, like they have done with domestic abuse courts, which has worked particularly well. So let's hope that does happen. Something that is happening, I think, is not uniquely in Wales, but it's one of the test areas in Wales in regards to criminal justice. Is we have a police response called Operation Soteria in Wales, and there's a couple of pilot sites within the UK, Wales being one of them. And basically, is a dedicated sexual violence investigation team, if you like, of dedicated trained detectives who work solely on this issue. That seems to be panning out quite well in terms of increased referrals, increased confidence of the police. As part of that, for our part in that, our independent sexual violence and advocates go out with the police to be with them when they take those first disclosures, make sure people get accurate information in terms of support available. So that seems to be going quite well. Something that they're piloting in Dyfed-Powys police region at the moment, which is great and also bad at the same time, is that previously there would be a threshold that would be decided normally by a detective inspector about a threshold for reporting A to the CPS or B to specialist services. They've removed that. So we're now getting referrals for things that we wouldn't have got referrals for in the past because they wouldn't have reached a threshold of sexual offence to come to us. That's great because we are now picking up people that are reporting to the police an issue that we wouldn't have formally dealt with. And when we get to meet with the client, we find out that there's far more serious stuff underneath that. I'll give you an example of that. 3 weeks ago, there was a 92-year-old where there was a lower level, if you like, report made to us that wouldn't have been reported to us before. It would have been NFA'd by the police. It wouldn't have gone any further. We talked to that client and discovered that for years they've been suffering rape within a domestic abuse setting, and we were able to intervene. Perpetrator was removed from the home. Blah blah blah. So it's really good, but it's presenting us with some real logistical challenges at the same time.
So the theme that we're looking for is a really joined up, proper pathway for
Yes.
managing all the issues that are not only relevant in younger life, but the additional issues that are presented by elderly people's specific circumstances. And Poppy, I know you have a particular interest in the intersection with dementia and disability and long-term health conditions, but we haven't really got time to go through that. But you are there as a resource for anybody who's at the conference and needs more about that afterwards. If we allow ourselves to talk as much as we would like to, we won't let anybody from the conference in. So can we open this up a bit now and see what questions we've got? Well, I've got one that's come in, and it's specifically about LGBTQ victims, survivors. Is there anybody who would particularly claim expertise in that and like to talk about services for older LB? I've got a dry mouth. I should have brought some water. Some water. Anybody wants to pick up that question?
I, as a member of the LGBT community, certainly don't profess to speak on behalf of the community, but what I will say is we've only just begun to think about the specific needs of older LGBTQ plus people. In Greater Manchester, there's been, which is going to be the first older persons housing that is just being created in Greater Manchester. Like, it makes me want to go, it is 2025. How are we only just thinking about this? And so thinking about older LGBTQ people in terms of sexual violence, there is so much to unpack with that in terms of the experiences that individuals have, particularly older LGBTQ people who are adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. There is so much intrinsic homophobia and stuff within that I don't necessarily think that we're doing a fraction of what we should be doing for older LGBTQ people within sexual violence. But, you know, it's something that we absolutely need to be really honest about. And it is not the same as LGBTQ plus people and sexual violence. Older people have very specific needs and understanding because of what our 4 brothers and 4 sisters have been through.
Yeah, the history is different, isn't it?
Yes.
That their lived experience is not your lived experience, one would hope.
Absolutely.
If I can come in ever so briefly, I think I completely agree with Duncan there. And from my previous experience working in the health and social care sector as well, I saw particularly older people going into care settings feeling as though even if they had lived openly and out as them true selves in the community, they felt like they had to go back into the closet within a care setting. And unfortunately, if we think about the impact that this would have, because they not only feared potential bias and retribution of sorts from the other residents, but potentially the staff that have got their own personal biases and working in that role. And if somebody is having to hide their true identity, how can we expect them to feel comfortable enough in those settings to make disclosures of potential abuse that is happening to them? So I agree with Duncan. I don't think that enough is being done in this area. And I think, unfortunately, particularly at the moment, the way that the news and the media and everything is presenting trans people, I am concerned about the impact that will have in terms of them feeling able to disclose and feel safe to do that with agencies and other services.
Poppy, that's a really good link to another question that's come in, and it's about that question is about perpetrators, and one of the subsections of the question is opportunistic perpetrators taking the opportunities that are offered, and I think that's what you're describing there. So can we talk a little bit more about who are the perpetrators and how to help us recognize and therefore protect the older people that we're focused on?
Can I come in briefly on that?
Please.
In answer to who are the perpetrators of sexual violence, they can be anybody in society, frankly, and by the very nature of what they're doing, they need to be organized. They're often intelligent. They know that it is socially abhorrent, and so they are often quite clever and scheming and groom not only the people that they abuse, but everybody else around them. So and where will you find them? You're likely to find them in places where they have access to people with vulnerabilities. We all recoil in horror when we hear news stories about teachers and sports coaches and the like perpetrated the most horrific sexual crimes. But that's the exact place where you would expect to find people who want to perpetrate sexual violence, in the places where they have access. And the same applies to older people. I would urge people to read this. There's some really good research by somebody that was commissioned by Hourglass, I think, Amanda Warburton-Wynne, about abuse of older people in care settings. The places where you would think people would be the safest are often the places where they are the most vulnerable. And reading that research quite shocked me. And some of our evidence of the people that older people that we work with that have been abused within care settings, and either by other residents, other patients, but quite often by healthcare workers as well. So should we be suspicious of everybody? Yes, sadly, yes. And be professionally curious and notice the signs, and don't just pass it off as it's you know, if there's a little nagging doubt, follow it up, because that gut instinct, you might be wrong. But I'd rather be wrong 99 times than ignore the one that I'm right about.
This leads on again to another of the questions in coming up from the floor. Mandatory training for all workers in the care community, because what you're saying is the vulnerable are in places where those workers are going to be. The access is arranged. Trust is implicit. How are we to manage the training for workers in the community to ensure that trust and access don't just make the situation worse?
I'll jump in there and to say, for me, what we keep talking about when we're talking about children is hidden in plain sight. We talk about the lack of training around spotting safeguarding. Like, it is exactly the same issue, but it's at the other end of the scale. And actually, there needs to be extremely specific training around safeguarding older people for everything that we've talked about. My biggest thing at the moment is, and I mentioned it before, around dementia. I have such concerns that those that are providing dementia care are not necessarily even thinking about the stuff that can come up. We talk about safeguarding in terms of safeguarding the individual from harm now, in terms of how do we make sure that there's not bad actors looking after our older people. And that's really important. But we forget about the fact that they may already have been abused just a very, very long time ago. And I really worry about that.
Just following on for that, sorry, Poppy, I'll be a very quick point. It's not a political point, is it? It might be. But there is something morally wrong, where I think with the people who are charged with the care of the elderly in our society are paid minimum wage and receive little training and little support. And no wonder we have a transient work force who work in this area. It's just not right. They need to be properly remunerated, properly trained. In other countries, it's seen as a vocation that people aspire to, not a job that you can get because you can't get anything else. And that needs to change.
You know, I'm really glad, Mike, that you went first there and made that point. And I will be very, very brief, Mary, because I'm aware we're over time. But my previous background is in the health and social care sector, working in care homes. And actually, I completely second what you've said. The amount of interviews that I went to where there was no interview. The question is, do you have your documentation? When can you start working? And then once you've accepted that job, you're handed a pack of DVDs that you watch, and that is the training that you're provided. And actually, that's a really scary thing that we're setting up everyone in that sector with, because ultimately, if you're provided with somebody then to give you that practical support on the floor, and that person has bad behaviours or has microaggressions towards the people that they're looking after, ultimately that new carer is going to pick up on those bad behaviours. And we're essentially training a workforce of people that do not have the right support, that don't feel they're able to whistleblow even because their job could be at risk. And ultimately, as you've said, they're underpaid and underappreciated when they do a great deal of work and are on the front line in terms of being able to safeguard older victim survivors that they may come across, both in the community and in care settings. I'll stop talking now, Mary. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to wrap up very, very, very briefly. First of all, by saying thank you to all the panel contributors. Thank you to everybody who put a question in the chat, and apologies to the people whose questions didn't get through. I think that just says to Hourglass, as the organisers of this, we've got to provide more of this incredibly important topic. You've all displayed the professional curiosity that Poppy was advocating for by asking those questions. You're here probably on minimal wage, Mike, pretty lowly paid compared with some jobs, getting your training, and you're the good guys, not, as Duncan said, the bad actors. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining in this discussion this afternoon. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you, everyone.